I was 24 when I first walked through those iron gates, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a recommendation letter from Mrs. Henderson, my previous employer. The Whitmore estate stretched before me like something from another century. Sprawling gardens, weathered stone walls, and windows that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. I had no idea that this place would become my prison, my sanctuary, and ultimately my greatest triumph. The master of the house, Edward Whitmore, was a man carved from granite and silence. At 62, he moved through his ancestral home like a ghost haunting his own life. His wife had passed 5 years earlier, leaving him with nothing but empty rooms and the weight of maintaining a legacy he no longer understood. When he hired me, his instructions were simple: keep the house running, stay invisible, and never presume to know what he needed. Those first months were brutal. I woke before dawn to prepare his breakfast. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, toast cut diagonally. He never looked at me when I served it, never acknowledged the care I put into arranging everything just so. I learned his routines by observation. He took his morning walk at precisely 7:30, returned to his study by 9, and expected lunch at exactly noon. Dinner was served at 6, and by 8 o'clock he had retreated to his private quarters, leaving me to clean up the remnants of another silent day. The estate itself was falling apart in ways that money couldn't immediately fix. The roof leaked in the east wing, the heating system groaned like a dying animal, and the garden that had once been the pride of the county now grew wild and untamed. But I saw potential in every cracked floorboard, every peeling paint chip, every overgrown rose bush. This wasn't just a house. It was a testament to something greater, a legacy that deserved better than slow decay. My background wasn't in domestic service, though Edward never bothered to ask. I had studied architectural preservation at university before my father's sudden death and my mother's illness forced me to abandon my dreams and take whatever work I could find. Mrs. Henderson had been kind enough to train me in household management, but my real education had been in understanding the bones of old buildings, the way they breathed and settled, the delicate balance between preservation and restoration. I began my work quietly, methodically. During my breaks, I would walk the grounds, taking mental notes of what needed attention. The fountain in the center courtyard had been dry for years, its marble basin cracked and stained. I recognized the craftsmanship, Italian marble, probably from the Carrara quarries, installed sometime in the 1920s. The damage was extensive but not irreparable. The greenhouse stood empty, its glass panes clouded with age and neglect. The iron framework was solid Victorian engineering, built to last centuries with proper maintenance. Even the staff quarters, where I had made my small home, spoke of better days when the estate hummed with purpose and life. The servants' hall had beautiful crown molding, now painted over with layers of institutional beige. The kitchen still had its original cast-iron range, a magnificent piece that just needed someone who understood its temperament. Everything about this place whispered of glory days and careful craftsmanship, of a time when people built things to last for generations. Edward rarely spoke to me in those early days, but I learned to read his moods in the way he held his shoulders, the rhythm of his footsteps on the hardwood floors. When he was particularly melancholy, he would stand at the window of his study for hours, staring out at the gardens his wife had loved. On those days, I would leave his favorite tea, Earl Grey with a single sugar cube, outside his door, never acknowledging the gesture, never expecting thanks. The loneliness of the estate was suffocating. Days would pass without hearing another human voice except for the occasional delivery person or maintenance worker. I began talking to myself while I worked, narrating my tasks just to break the oppressive silence. "Now we're going to tackle the dining room," I would whisper, "and maybe, just maybe, we'll find a way to make those windows sparkle again." But in my head, I was analyzing the room's proportions, noting the way the light fell across the parquet floors, imagining how it must have looked when it was properly maintained. As the seasons changed, I noticed patterns in the estate's decay. The property taxes were mounting, service bills were going unpaid, and Edward seemed increasingly detached from the practical realities of maintaining his family's legacy. He would disappear for days at a time, leaving me to manage contractors, answer phone calls, and make decisions about repairs that should have been his responsibility. It was during one of these absences that I discovered the truth about the estate's financial situation. A stack of unopened mail had accumulated on his desk, and when the water company called threatening to shut off service, I took it upon myself to investigate. What I found chilled me to the bone. Months of unpaid bills, tax notices marked final warning, and bank statements showing a steady decline into financial ruin. That night I sat in my small room and made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't watch this place, this beautiful, broken place, crumble into nothing. I had savings, modest though they were, and I had something more valuable, the knowledge to restore it properly. My university training had taught me not just about preservation techniques, but about the bureaucracy of historical properties, the tax incentives available for restoration, the grants that could fund proper conservation work. The next morning, I went to the county tax office and made my first payment. It was a small amount, just enough to keep the wolves at bay for another month. But it was a start. I told myself it was temporary, just until Edward got his affairs in order. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Over the following months, I began taking over more aspects of the estate's management. I negotiated with contractors, but not just any contractors. I sought out craftsmen who understood historical preservation, who could work with original materials and traditional techniques. I researched every aspect of the restoration, from the proper mortar mix for the stone walls to the authentic paint colors that would have been used in each room's original period. I scheduled repairs with the precision of a project manager, prioritizing structural integrity first, then moving to systems that would prevent further decay. I learned to forge Edward's signature on necessary documents, telling myself it was for his own good, that he was too lost in his grief to handle these mundane but crucial details. But I also began applying for historical preservation grants in the estate's name, writing detailed proposals that drew on my academic background to justify the funding requests. The gardens were my first major project, and here my passion truly showed. I spent every free moment researching the original landscaping, tracking down heritage plants, and learning the ancient art of topiary maintenance. Mrs. Whitmore's rose garden had been her pride and joy, and I was determined to restore it to its former glory. I discovered that she had been an accomplished horticulturist in her own right, corresponding with botanical gardens across Europe and maintaining detailed records of every plant's provenance and care requirements. I worked by moonlight some evenings, my hands bloody from thorns, my back aching from hours of digging and pruning. But I was also photographing everything, documenting the restoration process with the thoroughness of a scholar. I created detailed plans showing the garden's original layout, researched the historical significance of each plant variety, and began what would become a comprehensive archive of the estate's horticultural heritage. Edward never commented on the changes, but I caught him watching from his study window as I worked. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of recognition, perhaps. Or maybe just curiosity about the woman who had taken it upon herself to resurrect his wife's dreams. I wanted to tell him what I was doing, to share my discoveries about his family's history, but he had made it clear that I was to remain invisible, and I respected that boundary, even as it frustrated me. The property taxes became my responsibility entirely by the end of the second year. I had rationalized it as a necessity, a way to protect the estate from foreclosure while Edward sorted through his grief. But as I signed my name on those official documents, I felt the weight of what I was doing. I was claiming ownership, piece by piece, payment by payment, of a legacy that had never been meant for me. The transformation of the estate was gradual but undeniable. The leaking roof was repaired using traditional slate tiles that I had sourced from a historical supplier in Wales. The heating system was overhauled with modern efficiency, but hidden behind period-appropriate fixtures. The gardens began to bloom again, each flower bed restored according to the original plans I had discovered in the estate's archives. Visitors started to appear. Distant relatives, old friends, business associates who had heard whispers of the estate's resurrection. They would compliment Edward on the improvements, and he would accept their praise with a vague nod, never mentioning the woman who had orchestrated it all. I found myself becoming invisible in a different way. I was no longer just the hired help. I was the ghost in the machine, the unseen force that kept everything running smoothly. I knew every contractor's phone number, every plant's watering schedule, every creaky floorboard that needed attention. I had become the estate's memory, its conscience, its beating heart. I maintained detailed records of everything, every repair, every restoration, every historical discovery. I was building not just a preserved property, but a comprehensive archive of its significance. The loneliness remained, but it had taken on a different quality. I was no longer just enduring isolation. I was choosing it, sacrificing my own needs for something greater. I had no social life, no romantic relationships, no hobbies beyond the endless task of restoration. My youth was disappearing into the stone and mortar of someone else's legacy, and I told myself it was worth it. But I was also growing in ways I hadn't expected. The work was challenging me intellectually, forcing me to become an expert in everything from 18th century architectural techniques to modern conservation chemistry. I was corresponding with preservation specialists around the world, learning from master craftsmen, developing skills that went far beyond anything I had studied in university. By the 5th year, the estate had become a local landmark again. Wedding parties asked to use the gardens, photography enthusiasts came to capture the fountain's restored beauty, and the local historical society began including the property in their annual tours. Edward basked in the renewed attention, hosting dinner parties and social gatherings that showcased the estate's recovered grandeur. But I remained in the shadows, serving drinks and preparing meals for guests who never knew my name. I would catch fragments of conversation, compliments about the restoration, questions about Edward's vision for the property, speculation about how he had managed such a remarkable transformation. He never corrected their assumptions, never acknowledged the true architect of the estate's resurrection. The weight of my secret grew heavier with each passing year. I had become a fraud, living a lie that grew more complex with every tax payment, every repair authorization, every decision I made in Edward's name. I owned the estate in all but title, but I lived like a servant in my own home. The irony was devastating. I had never felt more accomplished professionally, yet I had never felt more invisible personally. During the 6th year, I made a discovery that changed everything. While cataloging the estate's archives, I found a collection of letters between Mrs. Whitmore and various preservation societies. She had been planning to donate the estate to the National Trust to ensure its preservation for future generations. The papers were detailed, outlining her vision for the property as a center for historical education and horticultural research. The letters revealed a woman of remarkable intelligence and foresight, someone who understood that private ownership was not sufficient to guarantee the estate's long-term survival. She had been in correspondence with university programs, planning to establish scholarships for students studying preservation and landscape architecture. Her death had ended these plans, leaving Edward with no knowledge of his wife's grand vision. I spent weeks reading through her correspondence, understanding for the first time the true scope of what this place was meant to become. Mrs. Whitmore had seen the estate not just as a family home, but as a living laboratory for preservation techniques, a place where traditional craftsmanship could be taught and preserved. She had envisioned research gardens where heritage plants could be studied and protected, archives where the estate's history could be preserved and shared. The breaking point came during the 7th year, when Edward announced his intention to sell the property. He had been approached by a development company that wanted to tear down the main house and build a luxury subdivision. The offer was substantial, enough to secure his retirement and more. He discussed it casually over dinner, as if the estate were nothing more than an inconvenient burden he was eager to shed. I said nothing that night, but I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and confronting the horrible truth of my situation. I had poured my life into this place, sacrificed everything for its preservation, and now he was prepared to destroy it all for money. The gardens I had nurtured, the rooms I had restored, the legacy I had fought to preserve, all of it would be reduced to rubble and profit margins. More than that, I would be destroying Mrs. Whitmore's vision, betraying the trust she had placed in this property's potential. I had the knowledge, the documentation, the expertise to carry out her plans. I had spent years preparing for a role I didn't even know I was meant to fill. The estate wasn't just my life's work. It was my calling, my purpose, the place where my education and passion had finally found their true home. The next morning I made another trip to the county courthouse, this time to research property law and ownership rights. What I discovered gave me hope and terrified me in equal measure. My years of tax payments had created a legal claim to the property, a complex web of financial responsibility that could be interpreted as ownership under certain circumstances. But more than that, I had documentation of my restoration work, evidence of my expertise, and a clear vision for the estate's future that aligned with its original purpose. I began documenting everything. Every payment I had made, every repair I had authorized, every decision I had executed in Edward's name. But I also began preparing something else, a comprehensive preservation plan that would demonstrate not just my ownership of the estate, but my qualification to be its guardian. I outlined Mrs. Whitmore's original vision, detailed the historical significance of every restoration I had completed, and proposed a sustainable future for the property that would honor both its past and its potential. The evidence was overwhelming. I had been the estate's true owner in all but legal title for years. The question was whether I had the courage to claim what was rightfully mine, and whether I could make the case that I was not just taking the property, but fulfilling its destiny. The development company's representatives arrived the following week, their suits and clipboards a stark contrast to the estate's timeless elegance. They walked through the rooms I had restored, across the floors I had refinished, past the windows I had cleaned 1,000 times. They spoke of demolition schedules and construction timelines, reducing my life's work to nothing more than obstacles to be cleared. But I saw something else in their casual dismissal of the estate's beauty. I saw the vindication of everything I had fought for, the proof that preservation required more than money. It required love, understanding, and the kind of deep knowledge that could only come from years of intimate connection with a place. These men saw only real estate value. I saw irreplaceable heritage. Edward seemed energized by their presence, more animated than I had seen him in years. He discussed lot divisions and profit margins with the enthusiasm of a man who had finally found a purpose. I served coffee and watched in silence as they planned the destruction of everything I had built, everything his wife had dreamed of preserving. That evening, after the developers had left, Edward called me to his study. He was in an unusually good mood, almost jovial as he explained his decision to sell. The money would allow him to move to a smaller place, something more manageable, without the constant burden of maintenance and upkeep. He spoke as if he were doing me a favor, releasing me from the obligation of caring for a property that had demanded so much of my time and energy. "You've done good work here," he said, the first direct compliment he had given me in 7 years. "I'm sure you'll find another position easily. I'll provide an excellent reference." I nodded and thanked him, but inside, I was screaming. He had no idea what he was throwing away, no understanding of the love and sacrifice that had gone into every restored detail. To him, the estate was just a house, a collection of rooms and furnishings that had outlived their usefulness. He couldn't see the soul that had been poured into its resurrection, the scholarship that had guided every decision, the vision that had transformed his property into something greater than he had ever imagined. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and sleepless nights. I met with property attorneys, researched adverse possession laws, and gathered documentation of my financial contributions to the estate. The legal landscape was complex, but the basic principle was clear. I had a legitimate claim to ownership based on my years of exclusive possession and financial responsibility. But I also began reaching out to preservation organizations, sharing Mrs. Whitmore's original correspondence and my own documentation of the restoration work. The response was overwhelming. Scholars and preservation experts who had never heard of the estate suddenly understood its significance. The National Trust, which had been preparing to work with Mrs. Whitmore before her death, expressed renewed interest in the property. University programs began inquiring about research opportunities and educational partnerships. The decision to act on my ownership claim was the hardest choice I had ever made. I was about to challenge a man who had employed me for 7 years to assert ownership of a property that had been in his family for generations. But I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy something that had become more than just a house. It had become my life's work, my legacy, my home. More than that, I was fighting for Mrs. Whitmore's vision, for the future she had imagined for this place. I was fighting for the students who would study here, the craftsmen who would learn traditional techniques, the researchers who would preserve heritage plant varieties. I was fighting for the idea that some things are too important to be destroyed for profit, that preservation is not just about the past, but about the future. I filed the legal papers on a Tuesday morning in October, the autumn leaves falling like tears across the estate's pristine grounds. The process was cold and bureaucratic, a stark contrast to the emotional weight of what I was doing. But with each signature, each notarized document, I felt something shifting inside me. I was no longer just the invisible caretaker. I was claiming my place, asserting my right to protect what I had built. But I didn't stop there. I also filed applications with the National Register of Historic Places, proposing the estate for official historical designation. I submitted grant applications to preservation foundations, outlining detailed plans for the property's continued restoration and its transformation into a center for historical education. I was building a case not just for ownership, but for purpose. Edward's reaction was explosive. He stormed into my quarters that evening, the legal documents clutched in his trembling hands, his face purple with rage. He accused me of betrayal, of taking advantage of his grief and confusion. He threatened to have me arrested, to destroy my reputation, to ensure I never worked in domestic service again. But I stood my ground. I had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed the words I would say. I reminded him of every unpaid bill I had covered, every repair I had authorized, every decision I had made to preserve his family's legacy. I showed him the records I had kept, the documentation of my years of financial responsibility and exclusive possession. Then I showed him something else, his wife's correspondence, her vision for the estate's future, the plans she had made for its preservation. I watched his face change as he read her words, as he understood for the first time what she had intended for their home. The anger began to transform into something else, recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the dawning realization that I had been carrying out his wife's wishes all along. She never told me, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She never said anything about these plans. I told him the truth then, the words I had been holding back for 7 years. I spoke of seeing the estate's potential, of believing in its importance, of refusing to let it die from neglect. I talked about the nights I had spent researching its history, learning about his wife's gardening techniques, understanding the architectural significance of details he had forgotten. I explained how the property had become my passion, my purpose, my reason for existing. But I also told him about my education, my training in preservation, my qualifications to carry out his wife's vision. I was not just a housekeeper who had overstepped her bounds. I was a preservation specialist who had found her calling, a scholar who had discovered her life's work, a woman who had been preparing for this role without even knowing it. He listened in silence, his eyes gradually focusing on my face, as if he were seeing me for the first time. When I finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, then stood and walked to the window. Outside, the gardens were glowing in the sunset, every plant and pathway a testament to years of careful cultivation and scholarly research. "I never noticed," he said finally. "I never saw what you were doing." The legal battle that followed was surprisingly brief. Edward's lawyers quickly realized that my claim was solid, built on years of documented financial responsibility and exclusive possession. The property taxes alone created a compelling case for ownership, and the additional evidence of my investment in repairs and improvements made my position nearly unassailable. But the real victory came when Edward himself acknowledged the truth of my claim. In a private meeting with our respective attorneys, he admitted that he had been absent from the estate's management for years, that he had allowed me to assume full responsibility for its preservation. He recognized that I had not only saved the property from ruin, but had transformed it into something greater, than it had ever been. More importantly, he began to understand his wife's vision for the estate's future. As he read through her correspondence and my preservation plans, he saw how perfectly they aligned, how I had been unconsciously fulfilling her dreams. The estate she had envisioned, a center for education, research, and preservation, was exactly what I had been building all along. The final settlement was more generous than I had dared hope. Edward retained ownership of the main house and a small portion of the grounds, enough to provide him with a comfortable retirement. I gained legal title to the majority of the estate, including the gardens, the outbuildings, and the commercial rights to the property's historical significance. But more importantly, I gained something I had never had before: recognition. Edward publicly acknowledged my role in the estate's transformation, crediting me with saving not just the property, but the legacy it represented. He also revealed his wife's original plans, explaining how I had been carrying out her vision without even knowing it. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the invisible guardian, who had preserved a piece of the county's history, and I found myself thrust into a spotlight I had never sought. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. I officially opened the estate to the public, offering guided tours that showcased its history and architectural significance. But these weren't just casual visits. I developed educational programs that drew on my academic background and years of hands-on experience. I partnered with local schools to create curriculum about historical preservation and gardening. I began hosting workshops where traditional craftsmen could teach disappearing techniques to a new generation. The estate received its official designation on the National Register of Historic Places, recognizing both its architectural significance and its role in preservation education. Grant funding began flowing in from preservation foundations and educational institutions, providing the resources needed to fulfill Mrs. Whitmore's vision completely. I hired staff to help with the increased activity, but I was careful to choose people who understood the estate's mission. I brought in graduate students studying preservation, craftsmen who specialized in traditional techniques, and educators who shared my passion for making history accessible to the public. Together we created something unprecedented, a working estate that served as both a historical site and a living laboratory for preservation techniques. Edward remained on the property, but our relationship had fundamentally changed. He was no longer my employer, and I was no longer his invisible servant. We had become something more complex, partners in the preservation of a legacy that belonged to both of us, each in our own way. He began sharing stories about the estate's history that I had never heard, details about his family's past that enriched my understanding of the property's significance. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent years trying to remain invisible, to serve without being seen, to preserve without being acknowledged. But in claiming ownership of the estate, I had been forced to step into the light, to assert my worth, to demand recognition for my contributions. The shy, invisible housekeeper had become a respected preservation expert, a leader in the field of historical education. The estate thrived under my public ownership. Visitors came from across the country to see the gardens I had restored, to learn about the preservation techniques I had developed, to experience the beauty I had fought to protect. But they also came to participate in the educational programs I had created, to learn from the craftsmen I had assembled, to understand the importance of preservation in their own communities. I began speaking at conferences about the estate's transformation, sharing not just the technical aspects of the restoration, but the personal journey that had brought me to this point. My story resonated with other preservation professionals, many of whom had similar experiences of being undervalued or overlooked. The estate became a symbol of what was possible when passion and expertise were finally recognized and supported. The greatest satisfaction came from the small moments: a child's wonder at seeing the fountain for the first time, a couple's joy at being married in the rose garden, a student's excitement at learning a traditional craft technique. These moments reminded me why I had fought so hard, why I had sacrificed so much, why I had been willing to risk everything for the preservation of something beautiful and meaningful. But there were also larger victories. The estate's success inspired similar projects around the country, with other preservation specialists reaching out for advice and support. I found myself consulting on restoration projects, helping other invisible guardians step into the light and claim recognition for their work. The estate had become not just a preserved property, but a catalyst for change in the preservation field. Edward and I developed an unexpected friendship in those final years of his life. He would often join me in the gardens, sharing stories about his wife and the estate's history that I had never heard. He began to understand what I had seen all along, that the estate was not just a building or a piece of property, but a living testament to the people who had loved it, worked on it, and sacrificed for its preservation. He also began to see me as his wife's true successor, the person who could carry out her vision in ways he never could. He started sharing more of her correspondence with me, revealing the depth of her scholarship and the scope of her ambitions for the estate. Together, we worked to establish the research programs she had envisioned, creating partnerships with universities and botanical gardens that would ensure the estate's continued significance. When he passed away 3 years later, he left me a letter that I treasure to this day. In it, he thanked me for seeing what he had been too blind to recognize, for preserving what he had been too broken to protect, for believing in the value of his family's legacy when he no longer could. He wrote that I had not stolen the estate from him. I had saved it for him, for his memory, for the future generations who would walk through its gardens and marvel at its beauty. But the letter also contained something else, a formal acknowledgement of my role as his wife's intellectual successor, a recognition of my qualifications to carry out her vision. He had finally understood that I was not just a housekeeper who had overstepped her bounds, but a preservation specialist who had found her true calling, a scholar who had discovered her life's work. The estate continues to flourish today, 30 years after I first walked through those iron gates as a young woman with nothing but hope and determination. It has become a model for historical preservation, a destination for lovers of beauty and history, a living testament to the power of believing in something greater than oneself. The educational programs I established have trained hundreds of preservation professionals, and the research conducted here has contributed to conservation efforts around the world. The estate now houses a permanent collection of preservation research, including detailed documentation of every restoration technique used in its own transformation. Students come from around the world to study here, learning not just about historical preservation, but about the importance of recognizing and nurturing hidden expertise wherever it might be found. I've written extensively about the estate's transformation, not just as a case study in preservation techniques, but as an example of how passion and expertise can triumph over invisibility and neglect. My book about the restoration process has become a standard text in preservation programs, and I've been invited to lecture at universities around the world. But for me, the estate remains something more personal. It is the place where I learned that invisibility is not the same as worthlessness, that service can be a form of scholarship, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is to see the potential in something that others have forgotten or abandoned. It is the place where I discovered that home is not just where you live, but where you choose to pour your heart, your knowledge, and your dreams. Every morning, I still wake before dawn and walk through the gardens, checking on the roses, adjusting the fountain's flow, ensuring that every detail meets the standards I set so long ago. But now I walk as an owner, not a servant. I walk with the knowledge that every flower I planted, every stone I restored, every decision I made in those long, lonely years was worth it. The estate taught me that preservation is not just about maintaining the past. It is about creating a future where beauty and meaning can flourish. It taught me that expertise is not always recognized immediately, but that doesn't make it less valuable. Most importantly, it taught me that sometimes the greatest victories come not from demanding recognition, but from quietly, persistently, lovingly doing what needs to be done until the world has no choice but to acknowledge the value of what you have created. I am no longer the invisible woman who cleaned and cooked in silence. I am a recognized expert in historical preservation, a respected educator, a guardian of cultural heritage. I am the woman who refused to let something precious die from neglect, who saw potential where others saw only problems, who transformed not just a property, but an entire approach to preservation and education. The estate stands today as proof that dedication, knowledge, and unwavering commitment can overcome any obstacle. It is a testament to the power of seeing potential where others see only problems, of believing in beauty when others see only decay, of choosing to serve something greater than oneself, even when that service goes unrecognized and unrewarded. But it is also proof of something else, that expertise and passion can be found in the most unexpected places, that the person emptying your trash bins might be the scholar who saves your legacy, that the invisible worker might be the visionary who transforms your property into something greater than you ever imagined. The estate is my legacy now, but it is also a reminder to the world that brilliance knows no uniform, no title, and no predetermined path. This is my story, not just of how I came to own a grand estate, but of how I learned to own my expertise, to claim my place in the world, and to understand that the greatest transformations often begin with someone who is willing to see clearly what needs to be done and has the courage to do it, even when no one is watching, even when no one knows your name, even when the world seems determined to let beautiful things crumble simply because they are inconvenient or difficult to preserve. The estate is my home now, but more than that, it is my monument to the power of hidden potential, unrecognized expertise, and the transformative force of being truly seen. It is proof that one person's dedication can change not just a place, but the very understanding of what that place represents, and that sometimes the most important work is done by those who labor in shadows until the moment comes for them to step into the light and claim their rightful place as guardians of beauty, knowledge, and hope.